be very happy to hear a few comments, questions from you to at least foster some thought for the coming discussions. And as always, please introduce yourself as well, please.
I will ask a question to Dimitris afterwards during the lunch, but I wanted to ask a question to Ms. Pavanelli and Mr. Hammerberg. They both referred to the challenges that we have on social rights today, challenging also the International Labour Organization. But at the same time, they referred to the UN Agenda 2030, and there is also the social pillar discussion in the European Union now coming back to the discussion. I just wonder whether we are in a difficult situation. Usually we have to choose the positions and defend the cause from these positions. The idea of engaging into new instruments seems to me dangerous rather than defending the ILO conventions, the existing human rights instruments, including the European Social Charter, or perhaps even the EU Fundamental Rights Charter, which has a huge chapter on social rights, which you have completely forgotten. So are these elements, the social pillar of the EU, the UN Agenda 2030, an opportunity or a threat? That's the question.
And I'd like to ask the permission of the panelists if we could please maybe take 2 or 3 comments or questions together, and then we'll come to the panel, just to make sure as many voices as possible are heard. Let's maybe do ladies first, and then we'll come here, please.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tamara Conley. I'm an undergraduate student from the United States, as well as a human rights policy developer and activist. So it was very interesting hearing everyone's different perspectives from their line of work. And for me, all of this came to an intersection that is a reality, but sort of only discussed in academia concerning politicized humanism. The concept that we choose to recognize our humanistic characteristics and our associated rights after evaluation of our national border strengths, our strength of our currency, or our alliances. And this sort of affects the dynamic of the dialogue, this type of dialogue that happens or does not occur as often in international governance, and who is allowed to participate. So my question is, how do we expand this dialogue to those of the human rights that we are in defense of, when in the social economic policy reform, social responsibility is absent? And how do we connect these bridges in order to create sustainable solutions? So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's come to this side, maybe you first. Okay, please.
My name is Fabian Hamilton. I'm a Labour member of the United Kingdom Parliament and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs on the Labour team. I wanted to thank Akaash Maharaj for that really excellent and perceptive contribution, focusing in on tax evasion, and I guess tax avoidance too, which is supposedly the legal version of tax evasion. And thank him for the points he made about David Cameron. Obviously I was appalled that my own Prime Minister, although he's a different party, was tainted by the Panama Papers. But in a way, I wasn't delighted, because I think anybody who's tainted taints the rest of us. The public don't distinguish between a Conservative Prime Minister and Labour members of Parliament. They think we're all in it together. And so it's very damaging for the political process and for democracy itself. But I wanted to just maybe broaden it out slightly. The United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the G20 that contributes 0.7% of its gross domestic product to international development. And that is now enshrined in statute, and all the political parties agree with that. Before I was appointed as Shadow Minister, I was on the International Development Select Committee, a scrutiny committee that looks at that spending. And one of, Akaash, you pointed out something really important, that corruption kills more people in the world every day, every year, than wars and disease. But also, that money that the British taxpayers and taxpayers all over the world spend on international development and aid is absolutely vital for lifting the poorest countries and the poorest people in the world out of that grinding poverty. And yet some of that money, we know, goes to corrupt organizations and governments. And I wondered if anybody on the panel has got any idea, and I've tackled this as much as I can, and so's my committee, as to how we can stop that corruption and how we can ensure, I mean, you, Akaash, had a very good idea about how we can have registers of beneficial owners. Of course, it has to be universal, you're absolutely right, and we're leading the way in the UK. But how can we ensure that development aid monies, which every wealthy nation spends with the best possible motives in mind, is not diverted away from those who need it most?
Thank you. And final comment or question, Xavier?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Just to congratulate again Akaash for his speech, very clear. I would just make a quick remark saying that resigning, even when you are prime minister, doesn't mean that you are guilty, but some have the courage to resign. Others, like Putin or UK prime minister, they don't hear the message. My question will be, do we need, because that's for me, more than a crime against our humanity, do we need an international tribunal for that kind of acts, and a new one? To Dimitri, I will ask just a question. Do you think, Dimitris, that Turkey is blackmailing European Union, or is just diplomacy or politics to ask for visa for all Turkish to go in European Union if they have to respect the agreement while they are already taking the money?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to ask, perhaps those members of the panel who feel spoken to about those questions to give a very brief response, because we are very, very late with the schedule. So I would say we can't give full responses to all the questions, but at least a few brief reactions would be great. I know, Rosa, that one of the questions was directed to you, so maybe ladies first, and then whoever would like to make at least a brief contribution. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I totally agree with you. I think that we don't need to create a new bodies, new frames. What we need to do is to stick to the regulation and the international standards and the convention that we have, and maybe lobbying and advocating, because all the countries ratified and enforced these laws. 2030's agenda, the SDGs, is an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity. But to be a real opportunity, we need governments to reduce the overwhelming powers of business over the plan of their programs, either in developed and in developing countries. I think there's a risk, and the risk is that the business community has taken over a lot of power within the UN system, as already was said by Hammerberg before. I see that there's an attempt from the developing country to shift to the OECD the regulation of many of the aspects that are currently under the regulation of the UN system, and this means protecting the interest of the most developed and richest country in the world, instead of looking at the opportunity to share, the wealth with the developing country. And for me, the point remains having a strong and effective system under the UN umbrella. And the ILO discussion is the same. ILO is the agency for labor of the UN, is the only tripartite organization. Of course, as a trade unionist, I think we need to defend and protect and possible strengthening the role of the ILO as a human right. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, the basic human rights standards are there already in the books. what should be now happening is much more focus on implementation, realization of these rights. I see the Agenda 2030 as an attempt in that direction. The standards are sort of integrated there. Now there is a need to secure that governments and international organizations are following through. I think the key word in this is monitoring. Monitoring the implementation of what we have already agreed upon. And there are so many gaps. There is so much hypocrisy within governments. There is corruption. And the points made here actually, I think, emphasizes on almost everything said so far, the need to a much more thorough control of the reality when it comes to implementing human rights standards.
Very briefly on the question about Turkey, for 4 years before all this started, in Turkey we had around 2 million refugees stuck there, and the European Union was completely indifferent to that. So if Turkey is blackmailing the European Union, should that be a blackmail? I say that it's well deserved.
Thank you. Fabian, to your question, I'm glad that you mentioned that Britain has met the 0.7% of GDP commitment to international development, and that is remarkable. It would be remarkable at any time. It is all the more remarkable, in my view, that it has happened during a time of relative economic austerity within the government. The fact that despite economic uncertainty, despite cuts in other parts of the budget, there has been a cross-party recognition in the United Kingdom of the value of Britain being a leader in international development. Shows a great deal of enlightenment. And I can tell you it has done a great deal to project British influence throughout the developing world. But to your question about what is it that can be done to ensure that those funds and funds from other donors are used responsibly and aren't siphoned away by corruption, you're right to be alarmed. The UNDP United Nations Development Programme estimates that in total, the developing world loses $10 to corruption for every dollar it receives in official development aid. If we were able to reduce corruption by even 10% or 11%, that would be more money than all the donated funds in the entire, made from every country on the entire planet. In terms of what can be done, I would suggest two measures. The first is, it's not going to be surprising coming from someone who heads a parliamentary institution, but the development of parliamentary capacity and of parliamentary democracy in recipient countries. I know I'll be preaching to the converted with you, but parliamentarians are the watchdogs of democracy. And it is a tragedy that so many citizens of so many democracies perceive our watchdogs as having muted their bark, muzzled their bite, and having been neutered by the very powers they're meant to hold at bay. To the extent that we're able to increase parliamentary capacity, that is domestic, democratically accountable oversight over the executive branch's use of public power and public funds. And I think that it is an important step for all countries. There's an especially important role for the United Kingdom because it has exported its form of parliamentary democracy to so many countries around the world. The second way, I think, is for all countries in the developed world to strengthen their laws against their own corporations and their own citizens engaging in corrupt activities in the developing world. It is next to impossible for a kleptocrat in a developing country to steal $1 billion or £1 billion without some of that money passing through the institutions in the developed world and some of that corruption being facilitated by actors in the developed world. Laws that say that citizens active in one country will be committing a crime if they facilitate corruption in the developing world have a powerful disincentive effect, and I think raise the stature of that country. And finally, I would say that engagement of civil society is, again, a very important way of combating corruption, because at the end of the day, the people who are being stolen from are the local population. They have the greatest stake in ensuring political rectitude, and they have the greatest knowledge about what's going on the ground. But I do have to say, I think the Department for International Development of the United Kingdom has been exemplary in its work in all of these fields. For Kita, your question about should there be an international tribunal for corruption? Short answer is I think yes. Again, the tragedy is that too often the people the people who commit the most serious acts of corruption are the least likely to be brought to justice because they're able to use their wealth to pervert and co-opt the national domestic institutions that should be holding them to account. As a result, if there is to be any hope of bringing the worst kleptocrats to justice, it must be through the coordinated use of international institutions. There are undoubtedly some forms of corruption that are so grave whose consequences for human rights, human welfare, and the human condition are so catastrophic that they should shock the conscience of the international community and mobilize the will of institutions to work across borders. In addition to international institutions, we believe that there should be treaty obligations between states to prosecute in any country of the world kleptocrats who have committed their crimes in another country. Because typically, someone who steals $1 billion from a developing country isn't stealing it because he wants to enjoy it in that country. It's because he wants to spend it in New York, in Paris, and in London. And I think there should be an obligation for the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, if they are able to lay hold of such a person, to prosecute him in the same way that we would prosecute people who have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in other jurisdictions. I would say, as a final aside, one of the projects that Gopac is pursuing right now, and I can't say too much about it, is that in working with our colleagues in the United States, we've heard a lot about how the United States is very skeptical of engagement in international treaties and international institutions, and that's very much the case. But there are two ways in which the United States completely outpaces the rest of the world. The first is their willingness to prosecute people who pass illicit funds in their own institutions. And secondly, the extent to which Americans just love suing people. And with that in mind, we intend to bring a civil case in New York State against a Russian kleptocrat who has secreted his illicit funds in Manhattan real estate. We hope to sue him on behalf of the people of Ukraine and of Russia. If we can't put him in jail, at least we can strip him of his illicit wealth and return it to the people he's harmed.
Well, thank you very much. I would just like to also express my gratitude to all of the panelists for a brilliant panel, and especially a big thanks to Ögmundur Jónasson for the wisdom of putting together not only this great panel, but the event itself as well. And thank you again very much to Valor. So if we could please express our sincere gratitude to all of the panelists as well as the main organizers.